Alright guys, here's another one I had to re-record the audio for. So here what I'm doing is I am going to be cutting out the tapers for those small upper aprons. So what I've done, I've double stick taped a piece of MDF to the sliding panel on the panel saw, and then I'm very, very, very carefully holding that in place. My fingers get very close to the blade, so this is not something I would really suggest you guys doing. But because these pieces were so small, it was hard to cut this taper in a better way. One thing I could have done if I was to do this again was to cut the taper before I cut everything else, because then I could have done it from longer pieces of wood, and then would have been able to keep my fingers further away from the blade. So I'm going to do this for those three upper supports, or the two outside aprons and that middle piece that I cut in the last video with the half lap to support the slats. Um, at this point, these cuts are really, they're like design features. They don't do anything to add support or anything. They're purely aesthetic, but making things like this really take it from being kind of in my mind, an unfinished piece to something that shows that a lot of thought was put into it. Um, by the time at the end of by the time everything's assembled, you'll be able to see kind of all of these small little details, the tapers on these aprons, on the legs, the chamfers on the tops of the legs, um, rounding everything over and breaking the edges. All of that really adds nice design elements to it. It makes it look like a finished product. All right, so here, what I'm doing, these are the small legs I'm cutting first. These are the tops. I'm adding a 45-degree chamfer all the way around. Basically, what a chamfer is when you have an angle that comes, it doesn't go all the way to a point. It goes so there's still a flat face on the top. So it'll look kind of like a flattened pyramid. And I'll show you it once it's done being cut. This is going to be done on top of all four of the legs. It should be the same distance from all of them, so they're still identical in looks. Um, but again, instead of having squared, kind of blocky looking corners, this just, in my mind, it makes it look a lot nicer. So here we'll just fast forward a little bit through this. This is just cutting the other legs. So that was the other short leg. Now I'm going to get the long legs out here, and I'm resetting my stop block that's at the end. Um, the reason for using the stop block is to make sure that all four cuts on each of the legs are at the exact same position. If it slid even a fraction of an inch on one of the sides, that little pyramid at the top isn't going to line up, and it's going to look really weird. It's basically going to have three sides that might line up, and then the fourth one is going to be either lower or higher, and it's going to break the look. All right, so next, I'm back on the bandsaw now, and what I'm doing here is cutting the taper on the legs. Normally, I would use the shaper, which I haven't really talked to you guys about to do this, but because these legs are so thin and it's such a small taper, the amount of setup that would have gone into getting the shaper ready and the jig I needed to hold everything in place safely, it just wasn't worth the time to do it. So what I did was very carefully measured out and marked where I need the taper to go. And then I'm just running it quickly through the bandsaw, trying to get as straight as possible. And then after I'm done here, I will bring it to the disc sander to quickly try and even it out. Once this is done, I still do need to sand everything. Every single piece that's going into this needs to be sanded. The edges all need to be broken. Um, and then only at that point can I really fully assemble and glue. And when I say breaking the edges, you'll see that in the next part. Uh, I don't want to leave everything squared up and sharp on the edge. What happens if everything stays squared is anytime something hits it, there's a very good chance it's going to ding the corner. It's going to dent it. It might chip it. Also, the other thing is when you put a finish on it, finishes don't really like adhering to sharp corners. They want some kind of rounded over edge. So even if it's as simple as taking a piece of sandpaper and just running it back and forth on the corner a few times, that'll be enough to break the edge. And it's just softening that corner, mainly so the finish can adhere. It feels a lot better when you're holding it or interacting with it. You can imagine if you're sitting on a chair that had all sharp edges, it's very quickly going to feel uncomfortable. So by breaking the edges, that natural rounded corner feels a lot better. It doesn't dig into us. And so pretty much every piece is going to have a broken edge of some kind. You could do that with sandpaper, like I said, or you can do it with a router. All it needs is some kind of treatment. And again, like the tapers on the aprons and on these legs, not only is it holds the piece up for longer, there's less chance of it being nicked or dented, it also adds that aesthetic look that makes it feel more like a finished piece. If I didn't break all these edges, yeah, it still works, it still functions perfectly fine, and it still probably would look pretty good, but you'll see by the end, by the time I'm done with everything, all these little details, they add up very, very quickly, and they're things that your everyday person might not ever even realize or think about, but as soon as you don't do them, it becomes apparent that something isn't quite done with it. So that goes for everything from, say, coasters to picture frames to furniture. If you look around at anything wooden at your house, it's very unlikely that you will find anything with a sharp edge. Everything is probably rounded over, even just a fraction. All right, so what you see me doing right now is, so I've cut the first taper on all of the legs. My design calls for having 2 tapers on each leg. The two inside faces are going to be the ones that have it. So after I cut the first one, I realized that I had cut the other lines I drew off accidentally. So I'm just redrawing those marks. The way I did it was at the bottom, I knew I wanted to go in a 1/4 of an inch. That way it goes from being a 1-inch square leg to down at the bottom where the taper completes, it'll be a 3-inch square that just kind of flares out to a point. So I knew where the line was going to start. I had drawn that line all the way around, and now I'm just connecting it to that bottom, and then I will be running it through the bandsaw again. One thing I should also mention, when you're doing something like this, you really want to be aware of the order you're doing it. What you want to do is cut them in a way where there's always a fully flat piece against the table. That way it's fully supported. If you're cutting it where you do a taper and then you flip it over so that part that you just cut is what's against the table, there's going to be a lot of vibration, which is going to cause a very inaccurate cut. Alright, over here what I'm doing is I'm going to turn on the disc sander and just very quickly try and touch up, remove any of the bandsaw marks from the tapers. The disc sander is a very, very aggressive sander, so it takes away material very quickly, so you have to be very delicate while you're using it. I'm pretty sure there's 1 or 2 spots where I went a little overboard with it, and I mean, the length of this part of the video, it's a minute long, so I wasn't really using this machine for that long, but like I said, it quickly removes material, so you have to be very aware of how much is being removed. Even though I've sanded the tapers on the disc sander here, I'm still going to go back and hand sand all of those tapers with a sanding block because I want to make sure everything about this piece is fully sanded to the same grit level. Alright, so this last section of the video. This is the router I was talking about. It is a handheld power tool. In the middle of the bottom, there is a router bit, which in this case has a 1/8 inch roundover, which means it is going to carve a quarter of a circle into the piece of wood with an 1/8 of an inch radius. So it's a pretty small roundover, but it's going to add an effect where it's just kind of blunting these corners, and it's going to feel a lot better, look a lot more finished. With a router, you want to be aware of the direction you're going. You'll see everything except for the very end. I always move away from me because I'm feeding the wood against the direction of the bit, which makes it a lot easier to control. The other thing you need to be aware of is the speed that you're moving. If you go too fast, you might not get an even cut. If you go too slow, however, what's going to happen is there's going to be lots of burning. Any of these tools, if you go too slow, you're fighting against friction. The wood you're cutting can actually start smoking and catch on fire if you leave it in place for too long. Any of the places you see on my wood where it looks really dark and burnt, that's because it is. At whatever point in the stage, it was probably on the table saw as I was cutting these pieces. I might have paused for half a second to relocate my push stick, and that half a second against the table saw blade just burnt the piece of wood. The good thing is, since I need to sand these anyways, you'll be able to remove all those burn marks. It just creates a little more work for yourself. So it might be a little hard for you guys to see, but the edges of each of these pieces, or each of the faces of this one piece, are now done, and they have a nice little roundover, which it's not hugely noticeable, but it's one of those things that, like I said, it adds up, and it really adds a finishing detail to it. So I'm just going to fast forward through this as it's more of the same, but you guys should see, just to reiterate the importance of it, that it gets done on all of the legs. The one thing I do need to decide is there are some areas when things come together where I don't necessarily want to have a roundover. I want to keep that very perfect square look, especially where the half laps for the slats and the aprons come together. So I have to decide how I want to break those edges still. But that's for another